Welcome to BWC News, I am Elizabeth. According to CCTV News on May 18, local time on May 17, U.S. President Joe Biden released a speech saying that the U.S. government understands that a U.S. debt default would have disastrous consequences for the U.S. economy and the American people. Biden said he held a meeting on budget issues with congressional leaders on the evening of May 16 local time, and they agreed that if the U.S. does not default on its debt, the government will reach an agreement on budget-related issues. The two parties will continue to negotiate on the divergent parts of the budget and reach agreement on the details. Biden also said he will continue discussions with congressional leaders on the debt ceiling in the coming days until an agreement is reached. He is expected to hold a press conference on the 21st local time to discuss the issue. Biden reiterated that the U.S. will not default on its debt. House Speaker McCarthy said on the 18th that he believes the U.S. will not default on its debt because congressional leaders and President Biden's administration are sitting down to negotiate. Biden also said at the White House before departing for Japan to attend the G7 meeting that he believes all parties will eventually reach an agreement that the U.S. will not default on its debt, and that congressional leaders have agreed that they will not default. Biden noted that the parties will continue to negotiate until an agreement is reached. In the tightening of the debt ceiling negotiations, getting closer to the earliest triggered deadline for default, both President Biden or Republican House Leader McCarthy, trying to reassure people, trying to dispel the debt ceiling may trigger default concerns. Yellen has repeatedly warned that the U.S. may default on its debt in early June, and it is in this context that some countries are increasing their holdings of U.S. debt. A few days ago, the U.S. Treasury Department released the International Capital Flows Report for March 2023, a report with a more compelling data, that is, continuous selling of U.S. debt for up to 7 months. China, in March, uncharacteristically chose to increase its holdings of U.S. debt, compared to the size of the U.S. debt held in February increased by $20.5 billion. This not only ended China's habit of continuously reducing its U.S. debt holdings since July last year, but the scale of the increase was also relatively large. Why did China increase its holdings of U.S. debt at a time when March was the month when Silicon Valley Bank was in the midst of a bankruptcy crisis? Is this a sign of improving relations between the U.S. and China? The answer is actually no, because the countries that increased their holdings of U.S. debt in March were not only China, but also Japan and some European countries. Unlike what people generally think, the reason why overseas holders of U.S. debt did not sell U.S. debt because of the risk of the U.S. financial crisis, but increased their holdings after the liquidity crisis in the U.S. banking sector came to the fore and the bankruptcy of Silicon Valley Bank, is that the overseas holders of U.S. dollars still believe in the bottom line of the U.S. government on the debt crisis compared to the U.S. financial crisis. To put it bluntly, this is the lesser of two evils. Including China, the world's major economies, due to the influence of the dollar is the world currency properties. In the time of international trade, most of the hands will accumulate down some dollars. Especially like China, a large country in the United States and China trade in a long-term surplus position, through the United States and China trade to earn a lot of dollars in hand. These dollars may not be able to spend out in a timely manner, especially now the United States government launched a series of sanctions against China, prompting China wants to buy high-tech products from the United States, often cannot buy. This prompted us to hold the dollar foreign exchange. There is no opportunity to spend, can only be temporarily saved. The accumulated dollars will either be deposited in U.S. banks or purchased in U.S. treasuries. After the bankruptcy of Silicon Valley Bank in March and the liquidity crisis of U.S. banks, a large amount of foreign exchange in U.S. dollars stored in U.S. banks is actually not safe anymore, because the U.S. government can make a bank fail at any time. In this case, those who originally existed in the form of deposits of U.S. dollars foreign exchange can only find another way out, and the current bad economic situation in the United States, only the U.S. Treasury bonds also have relative credibility. Because once the dollar national debt bankruptcy, then the impact on the U.S. economy will be fatal. So the U.S. government would rather let more banks go bankrupt, but will not allow the U.S. Treasury default. It is out of this alarm to the banking sector bankruptcy crisis, there is a large number of overseas holders of U.S. Treasury bonds, and turn to increase their holdings of U.S. debt. From this perspective, China's increase in U.S. debt holdings in March is more like a financial hedge, and has nothing to do with U.S.-China relations. nor does it represent China's initiative to release goodwill to the U.S. and seek to improve U.S.-China relations. So what about the recent meeting between the top brass of China and the U.S. in Vienna, Austria, and the news reported by some Western media about possible interaction between the top brass of China and the U.S. at the upcoming APEC ministerial meeting? This can be analyzed from two perspectives. First, in recent times, the U.S. government has actually shown some vague signs of compromise in its policy toward China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen said in a previous meeting that the United States does not seek to suppress China technologically or economically, but only to prevent China from gaining a military advantage over the United States. This is in effect a veiled indication that the U.S. is likely to curtail its strategy of suppressing and containing China by slightly tightening its sanctions and embargo on China in the economic and technological spheres, and focusing instead on maintaining a military advantage over China. Although this statement by Yellen has not yet seen actual action, it has at least shown some signs of a change in the U.S. attitude. Second, since the current game between China and the U.S. involves not only China and the U.S. but also global peace and stability, and given the premise that the global security and economic situation is now both deteriorating, the international community is expecting China and the U.S. to maintain a relatively stable relationship. China pursues a strategy of uniting most countries for development together, and we could care less about the demands of the United States, but we still have to respond to this call for stability in Sino-U.S. relations by most countries around the world. As a result, China has been slightly more relaxed in its approach to the issue of engagement and dialogue with the United States. However, this does not mean that Sino-U.S. relations will be completely improved, because the condition that the U.S. must first make a sincere move if the U.S. wants to really ease and improve Sino-U.S. relations, which the U.S. has not yet done. According to U.S. media reports, President Joe Biden recently prepared to use his presidential extraction authority to provide Taiwan with $500 million in arms aid, once again staging a farmer and snake scenario, and U.S. actions will not help improve Sino-U.S. relations. China can show its willingness to engage and dialogue, but in the end, it is up to the U.S. to take concrete actions to properly manage risks and complete substantive Sino-U.S. dialogue and exchanges. Some Western media are now actively playing up the possibility of contact between Chinese and U.S. leaders, or between senior Chinese and U.S. officials, at the APEC ministerial meeting in Detroit and the subsequent APEC Leaders Summit, which is actually a unilateral statement by the U.S. At least until now, there has been no substantive official response from China. To put it bluntly, the U.S. now hopes that China and the U.S. can communicate, so it is deliberately creating this atmosphere of possible dialogue and communication between the top levels of the two countries, but it remains to be seen whether this will turn out to be true. There is no guarantee that the U.S. government will not act in the same way as it did in February this year, when the U.S. abused force and destroyed a Chinese meteorological research airship for no apparent reason, again affecting relations between the two countries.